Hello everybody, welcome to the second video in this series of webinar trainings for the High School After School Club.
Great. So to start off this section, it's important to know what ARYSE is and how it has been a part of the refugee and immigrant community for the past several years in Pittsburgh. So ARYSE stands for the Alliance for Refugee Youth Support and Education. And as exhibited by the mission statement also here on the page, its goal is to support immigrant and refugee youth in becoming engaged, confident, and celebrated members of the Pittsburgh communities. ARYSE was founded in 2013 by undergraduates at the University of Pittsburgh, including the executive director, Jenna Barron. At the beginning of ARYSE's existence, it was primarily focused on Prize Academy, which is a summer program for immigrant and refugee youth, primarily geared towards preventing the summer slide and keeping language skills and social skills up during the summer months when students weren't in classes. From 2013, ARYSE's programming has gradually expanded. Prize during that time continuously grew in the number of students it served, and eventually the need was, it was seen that there was a need for after-school programming as well, at which point the after-school club was founded. That program originally took place only in Crafton Heights. Crafton Heights has a strong immigrant and refugee community, and it had become clear to both ARYSE and JFCS that students living in that area really needed some extra out-of-school time support. So originally the program was held, again, in Crafton Heights as a combined program between K through 8 and high school, so everybody was all in the same program. As interest in the program grew, the program eventually split into two parts, where we now have a contingent that is K through 8 and a contingent that is just high school. And after hearing a lot of input from both mentors in the program and the high school students themselves, we as organizations found that it would be most beneficial to actually move the high school program to a college campus, which is how it came to be at Duquesne University. And Duquesne has been a huge part of the after school club since its beginning a few years ago, providing a huge part of the volunteer capacity that the program uses to run.
And of course the second organization that is a partner on this program is JFCS. And so I myself, Andrew, am the volunteer coordinator for JFCS Refugee and Immigrant Services. And so we are a resettlement agency here in Pittsburgh. We do refugee resettlement in addition to serving other immigrants regardless of any status, but we specifically have programming to resettle people who come through the United Nations and State Department refugee programs. So we help families right when they arrive through reception and placement by meeting them at the airport and making sure that their adjustment goes well. We also provide preferred communities programming, which is actually intensive casework for anybody who is in need. So it's not necessarily preferred communities, it's kind of a weird name, but they are serving people with significant health issues, single parents, mental health issues, and so that's a way to serve refugees even after the reception and placement period. Of course, we're also helping everybody to access health care and find employment. And we also have developed a peer support groups program which develops leaders within the community who lead monthly groups to do really whatever they want, whether it be outings to cultural events or meditation or sewing or cooking, really anything. And of course, all of these are supported through volunteering. Many of you helping us with the After School Club, but also in-home mentors, building relationships with families, family fun events, which is helping families access cultural institutions in Pittsburgh and just having fun and celebrating American holidays to learn about them, and of course donations as well. So some of you may have seen this chart before. It discusses the number of displaced people in the world. So you see here at the top that there's 68.5 million displaced people, 40 million of which are within their own country, but 25.4 million, although I guess the number is now more in 2019, about 25 million people are refugees with refugee status. That's a legal designation. There are many refugees who actually have asylum-seeking status, which is meaning that they're fleeing persecution back home. However, they're not seeking refugee status through the United Nations. So, folks at our southern border right now who are coming into the country fleeing violence in Central America, they are refugees from Central America, but they are seeking asylum in the United States instead of going to maybe Ecuador to find a refugee camp and apply for United Nations status there. So, a person who comes to the U.S. with refugee status, we already know everything about them after doing multiple years of security checks. Whereas an asylum seeker, the first time they step in our country is the first time we've ever tried to do any background check. So that's an important distinction to understand for the population we're working with. These people that we're working with in the after school club are primarily coming from these countries. So a lot of the students are coming from Eastern Africa. That's include, their families are originally from Eastern Congo, perhaps. Also, some from Somalia and Ethiopia and Eritrea. We have some Burundian and Rwandan people, and then many of the kids also lived in Tanzania, Kenya, or Uganda in refugee camps. Many other students originally are from Syria or Iraq. There are some Afghan students as well, and then this year we also have a Burmese family who just arrived in the U.S. So most of the families in After School Club were resettled by JFCS, although not all of them. And then certainly in the high school program, they do additional recruitment outside of the JFCS population to bring in those folks. So I'm sure you'll see people even from other areas of the world included in the student group that you'll be working with. So let's quickly go over the refugee resettlement process and how a refugee would get from a place like Aleppo to Pittsburgh. So it's work through 4 different organizations: the United Nations, the State Department, HIAS, and JFCS Refugee and Immigrant Services. So the first step is to apply through the United Nations. So they have to somehow get to that camp. Often they have to get smuggled over the border, or do something risky in order to flee their home country. And then they go to a country like Jordan if they're fleeing Aleppo. Within Jordan, they find a United Nations office or a refugee camp, and they apply for their status, where they have to go through multiple interviews. After all those interviews, they go through the international health and criminal background checks, which are all doubled up. They're actually done by the United Nations first, and then they're also done by the third country where they'll be resettled to. So this is done using iris scans, blood scans, fingerprints. They separate all the individuals in the family to match up their stories and understand their whole social network, to make sure that these people are safe for entry into the refugee camp and into a third country. So refugee camps will often look like this: tented cities, sprawling over across many miles with hundreds of thousands of people there. But first off, it's important to understand that when we think of refugee camp, obviously it brings up a negative connotation, a lack of safety that comes into our mind. But for many of our kids, they found the refugee camp as home. That's where they grew up for the majority of their childhood, and so they actually identify with that as home. And so it's important to remember that when you're having conversations with them, that they may think of the refugee camp differently, and so we don't want to just ask questions that ask about how depressing the camp was. Just talk about it like it was the last place they had lived, and they may see it through a different lens than we do. But not all families spent time in a refugee camp like this. Some may have found an apartment in a city like Istanbul or Kigali in Rwanda, and they just found a United Nations office within that city, and they were able to freely roam the city and hang out, and then they would go to the UN office for their checks and interviews. Once they've been cleared for entry or cleared for status as a refugee, then the United Nations, first off, is of course trying to return that family home if that's possible. Their original home is where their own family is, their language is, their culture is there. So that's obviously their preference. But that's usually not very possible because the scale of the situations is large, and the governments who are persecuting these groups don't necessarily fall out of power very quickly. So then a second step is to integrate them into the country where that camp is located. So for example, if they're staying in a camp within Kenya, trying to integrate them into the Kenyan society and culture instead of resettling them to a third country like the United States. That's better for them because they're still closer to their family, they're closer to the culture and original language that they had been speaking. But because of the scale of refugee situations and the timeline on which these governments are persecuting people, resettlement to a third country like the U.S. or Canada is often necessary, and so that's what is done for the families that we're working with. So then the third step is reception and placement. That happens by the local resettlement agency. So for example, this picture on the screen here is showing a pickup at the airport of the last Syrian family that we had seen in the country since the travel ban. This was in February 2017. So this family arrived with more fanfare than usual. Usually it's just the caseworker and an interpreter at the airport. They help the family, get all their bags. They load them into the car and they drive them home, where their home is ready. The apartment is set up and ready to live in. There's a warm meal waiting for them, and their life is ready to go as soon as they arrive. Of course, it becomes very busy after that, with many different appointments. So things like the initial medical appointments, obtaining a social security number and enrolling on food stamps and cash assistance, getting a bus training from JFCS staff or interns. JFCS also provides cultural orientation classes. We enroll them into ESL classes at our partner. We enroll the children into school, and we obtain employment. So this is a lot of work that a lot of our staff and volunteer interns are doing. But as you notice, there's really the only thing that the kids get is getting enrolled into school. And so that's where the after-school club becomes very important. It's something that provides them not only with the academic support that's necessary, but also with the social and emotional support, to make them feel welcomed and valued, and also give them a place to be themselves, truly, and live within their own skin. And so that's, there was a lot of heavy work happening from the State Department's funding, but After School Club is actually funded outside of that because of the lack of commitment from the State Department, to beyond enrolling the children in school. So we also here at JFCS run the Immigrant Services and Connections Program, or ISAC as we like to call it. So this is a social services connector, meaning they are not setting the appointments and taking the client to the appointments. They are helping the client to make the appointments and showing the client how to get there, maybe, but it's not a continuous basis where for at least 3 months they're working with them. It's on a goal basis. So whenever the client's goals are achieved, they're phased out of service coordination, and they can always be welcomed back in. This is a partnership between 5 different agencies that we see here on the right hand side: SHIM, the South Hills Interfaith Movement; Casa San Jose; Literacy Pittsburgh; the Latino Family Center at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit; and then JFCS, which is the lead agency on the project. So generally, our immigrant populations in Pittsburgh are living in these areas. Of course, Crafton Heights is where most of the families are living, and that's where our K-8 program happened. That's, of course, most of the families that JFCS is resettling nowadays. Over the past 10 years, Carrick and Brentwood has been the major hub for refugees and immigrants in Pittsburgh, as well as the Green Tree area. And then Northview Heights has become a hub for especially the Somali community and the Burundi community, living in that area of the city.